The boutique encounter. The bustling streets of Beverly Hills shimmered under the golden rays of the late afternoon sun. Luxury storefronts lined the sidewalks, their gleaming glass windows reflecting the opulence of designer brands. The air buzzed with the scent of high-end perfumes and freshly brewed cappuccinos from a nearby cafe. Among the pedestrians walking down Rodeo Drive, a woman clad in casual yet stylish attire stepped into La Belle Maison, an exclusive high-end boutique known for catering to celebrities and the ultra-wealthy. Sandra Bullock had never been one to revel in extravagant shopping sprees. She preferred comfort over couture, sincerity over spectacle. But today was different. She was here looking for the perfect dress for a charity gala, something elegant yet understated. It was a rare occasion where she needed to dress to impress, not for the cameras but for a cause close to her heart. As she entered the boutique, the atmosphere was instantly colder. The soft chime of the entrance bell barely made a dent in the rigid aura of exclusivity. Glistening chandeliers draped from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over pristine marble floors. Velvet-clad mannequins posed in front of gold-accented mirrors, each adorned in dresses that whispered wealth. Sandra approached a sleek glass display counter where a boutique associate stood, meticulously adjusting a row of diamond-studded clutches. The associate, a tall, meticulously groomed woman with an air of haughtiness, barely spared Sandra a glance. "Excuse me," Sandra said with a polite smile. "I'm looking for a gown for a gala." The woman, Vanessa Belmont, the boutique manager, turned her sharp gaze toward Sandra. Her lips curled slightly, her trained eyes sweeping over Sandra's simple jeans and sweater, taking in the absence of a glitzy handbag or expensive jewelry. "I'm sorry, but our collection is exclusive." Vanessa's tone was clipped, professional, but underlined with quiet disdain. Sandra's smile faltered slightly. "I understand. I was hoping to see some options." Vanessa cut her off, her manicured fingers tapping against the counter. "Our clientele is carefully selected. We cater to those who appreciate true luxury." Another sales associate, a younger woman standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She recognized Sandra immediately, but the icy gaze of Vanessa kept her silent. Sandra, ever graceful, chuckled softly. "Well, I'd like to think I appreciate good design." Vanessa let out a light, insincere laugh. "We have an appointment-only policy for high-profile clients. We don't usually allow walk-ins." Sandra arched an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware of that policy." "It's an unspoken one." Vanessa's smile was tight. At that moment, the boutique doors swung open again. A tall figure entered, exuding an effortless charisma that turned heads even in a place accustomed to wealth and fame. Keanu Reeves, dressed in a casual black blazer, a gray t-shirt, and dark jeans, he carried himself with an air of humility that was almost paradoxical in such an extravagant setting. His presence was magnetic yet unassuming. He wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol of kindness, the rare celebrity who had remained grounded despite his success. Vanessa's demeanor underwent a dramatic shift. Her eyes widened, her posture straightened, and a polished, rehearsed smile stretched across her lips. She practically radiated hospitality now. "Mr. Reeves," she gushed, stepping forward with an enthusiasm she had utterly lacked moments ago. "What a pleasure to have you here. How can we assist you today?" Keanu's gaze flickered between Vanessa and Sandra. He had overheard just enough of the interaction to understand what had happened. Sandra, standing quietly to the side, looked at him and smiled. There was no resentment in her eyes, only an understanding of the situation. She wasn't going to make a scene. But Keanu would. He turned to Vanessa, his expression unreadable. "Actually, I was hoping to get some help for my friend here." He gestured toward Sandra. Vanessa's smile faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Oh, of course, Mr. Reeves. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but firm. Vanessa hesitated. Her mind raced for a justification, but there was none that would save her from the embarrassment Keanu had subtly imposed upon her. The younger sales associate, still standing quietly, seized the moment. She stepped forward and spoke up, her voice steady but defiant. "I'd be honored to assist, Ms. Bullock." Keanu turned to the young woman and gave her an approving nod. "That would be great." Vanessa, now flushed with embarrassment, stepped aside reluctantly. As the young associate led Sandra toward a selection of gowns, Keanu lingered by the counter, his gaze still on Vanessa. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even angry. But his mere presence held power, and his message had been sent without him needing to say much at all. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she straightened a misplaced clutch on the counter. She had humiliated a woman who, despite her status, carried herself with humility and grace. And now she had been called out by Keanu Reeves himself. Sandra emerged a few minutes later with a dress in hand, a stunning yet elegant piece that suited her perfectly. She turned to Keanu with a grateful smile. "Thanks for that." Keanu shrugged. "No thanks necessary." As they made their way to the counter, Sandra pulled out her wallet, but Keanu gently stopped her, sliding his own card to the cashier. "Consider it a gift," he said. Sandra shook her head, laughing. "You don't have to do that." Keanu grinned. "I know, but I want to." Vanessa, still standing at the counter, bit her lip as she watched the transaction unfold. She had made a terrible miscalculation, and now she could only stand there in silence as Sandra and Keanu walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, Keanu turned back one last time, looking Vanessa in the eye. "Kindness is free," he said softly. "You should try it sometime." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving Vanessa standing there, speechless. But the story wasn't over yet. Not even close. Ripples of redemption. The sun had begun its slow descent over the Los Angeles skyline, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold. The events of the day still lingered heavily in the air inside La Belle Maison, the luxurious boutique on Rodeo Drive. But while Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves had long since left, the impact of their encounter remained like a ghost in the room. Vanessa Belmont stood behind the glass counter, her manicured fingers gripping the polished surface with an iron intensity. The young sales associate, Emily Carter, who had dared to step in and assist Sandra, stood nearby, attempting to keep her expression neutral despite the tension thickening the air between them. Vanessa's heart pounded against her ribs, her hands were clammy, and a sharp heat of embarrassment curled around her throat like a noose. She had humiliated Sandra Bullock. Sandra Bullock. And worse, she had done so in the presence of Keanu Reeves, the man who had effortlessly undone her arrogance with a single sentence. "Kindness is free. You should try it sometime." His words echoed in her mind like a bell tolling at the end of an era. Her era. She had built a reputation in the boutique world as a woman of flawless exclusivity, the gatekeeper to luxury, the one who decided who was worthy of their collection. But in a single moment, Keanu had peeled back the thin veil she had so carefully crafted. And now she could feel the judgmental glances from her staff, from Emily, and from the few lingering customers who had witnessed everything. Vanessa inhaled sharply, trying to collect herself. She refused to let this moment break her. She was a woman of status, a woman of control. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she had either. The silent storm. That night, Vanessa returned to her luxury penthouse in downtown LA, but instead of reveling in its grandeur, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering city lights, the minimalist yet painfully expensive furniture, she felt suffocated by it all. She poured herself a glass of red wine, but it tasted bitter. The smooth jazz humming from her speakers irritated her rather than soothed her. She kicked off her designer heels and paced around the room, her mind a storm of emotions. How had she let that happen? How had she, Vanessa Belmont, the most sought-after boutique manager on Rodeo Drive, lost control of a situation so effortlessly? And why? Why did it bother her so much? She had dismissed people before, many times. She had made clients feel small, unworthy of the luxury they sought. It was her job, wasn't it? To maintain the exclusivity, the prestige, the unattainable allure of La Belle Maison. But tonight, she felt hollow. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of her soul, whispering truths she had long silenced. And then, before she even realized it, she was typing Keanu Reeves into her search bar. Articles flooded her screen. Stories of his generosity, his humility, how he gave away portions of his earnings to crew members, how he once bought a struggling stranger a meal and spent hours just listening to them, how he had endured immense personal loss, but never let it harden him. He was one of the richest, most famous men on the planet. Yet he walked through the world as if he had nothing to prove. And she had everything to prove. That was the difference. Vanessa shut her laptop abruptly, the weight in her chest pressing heavier. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. The unraveling. The next morning, Vanessa arrived at the boutique, as she always did, dressed impeccably, her head held high, a practiced smile ready to mask her lingering thoughts from the night before. But something was different. Her staff was quieter. Emily, in particular, avoided her gaze. The whispers behind the counter had increased. She knew why. They had seen her fall, and they were waiting to see if she'd rise or crumble. As she approached the counter, she noticed something that sent a fresh wave of discomfort through her. A neatly folded note, with her name on it. Her breath hitched as she picked it up. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Elegant, graceful, Sandra Bullock's. Vanessa hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, before carefully unfolding the paper. Dear Vanessa, I imagine yesterday didn't go the way you planned. But that's the thing about life. It humbles us when we least expect it. I wasn't offended by what happened. I've seen it before. I will see it again. But what really struck me was the way Keanu handled it. Not with anger, not with cruelty, but with kindness. Kindness is a choice, a habit, and sometimes it's not easy. But it's always worth it. I hope today is better than yesterday. Warmly, Sandra. Vanessa's throat tightened. Her fingers curled around the letter. Why? Why would Sandra do this? She had every right to hate her, to never step foot in this boutique again. But instead, she had left this, a note of understanding, of compassion. Vanessa felt something she hadn't in a long time. Shame. Not the kind that comes from getting caught, but the kind that comes from realizing you weren't the person you thought you were. An unlikely redemption. That afternoon, Vanessa found herself doing something she never had before. She called an emergency staff meeting. The employees of La Belle Maison gathered in the boutique's back room, exchanging puzzled glances. This wasn't like Vanessa. Meetings were always about performance, about maintaining the store's exclusivity. Never about this. Vanessa took a deep breath, feeling their skeptical eyes on her. I want to talk about yesterday, she began, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. A ripple of tension moved through the room. I made a mistake, a big one, and I let all of you witness it. Silence. I let my own idea of exclusivity cloud something more important, humanity. And for that, I want to apologize, not just to Sandra Bullock, but to all of you who had to watch it happen. The room remained quiet. Even Emily seemed unsure of how to react. Vanessa inhaled sharply, forcing herself to continue. We work in luxury, yes, but that doesn't mean we have to look down on people. It doesn't mean we have to treat kindness as a weakness. She looked directly at Emily then. Emily, you did what I should have done yesterday. You treated Sandra with respect. I owe you an apology too. Emily's eyes widened. This was the last thing she had expected. Vanessa's voice softened. I don't expect anyone to forgive me overnight, but I do want to do better, and I hope you'll hold me to it. The tension in the room shifted. just slightly. A few employees exchanged glances. Some nodded, subtly. Emily, after a moment, gave a small smile. Maybe this was the beginning. Maybe this was how real change started. And for the first time in years, Vanessa Belmont felt lighter. A second chance at grace. Vanessa Belmont had never struggled with self-reflection before. That was because she had never needed to. Her world had always been neatly ordered: luxury, exclusivity, status, and power. She had risen through the ranks of the fashion industry with sheer ambition, her reputation built on an ironclad belief that some people belonged, and others did not. But today, she sat alone in her office, staring blankly at her polished oak desk, Sandra Bullock's letter still resting beside her. Kindness is a choice, a habit, and sometimes it's not easy, but it's always worth it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the edges of the note. It was the first time in years that someone had spoken to her not in anger, not in contempt, but with understanding. And it terrified her. She exhaled sharply and reached for her phone. She had spent the entire night replaying the moment in the boutique over and over. It had been one thing to make a mistake, but another to be called out by Keanu Reeves. His words had haunted her all night. Kindness is free. You should try it sometime. It had taken her years to climb to the top, to build her authority in this world. And yet, in mere seconds, Keanu had stripped her of that false power with nothing but grace. Not anger. Not public humiliation. Grace. And she wasn't sure she had ever felt smaller. A step toward redemption. Vanessa did something she never did. She hesitated before making a decision. Her usual instinct was to control, to fix, to dominate. But this wasn't something she could simply fix by offering a discount or making a PR statement. She had to own this. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. A private event coordinator. She wasn't sure Sandra Bullock would ever step foot in La Belle Maison again, but that didn't mean she couldn't make things right in a different way. She picked up the phone and dialed. Carla, it's Vanessa Belmont. I need your help. It's urgent. Meanwhile, the unexpected call. Sandra Bullock had just finished an afternoon meeting with her charity foundation when her phone vibrated. She glanced down at the caller ID and arched an eyebrow. Vanessa Belmont. That was unexpected. With a curious tilt of her head, she answered. Hello. A pause. And then, a voice she hadn't expected to hear again so soon. Sandra, it's Vanessa. Vanessa's voice faltered for a second. She cleared her throat. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need a moment of your time. Sandra remained quiet for a beat, then leaned back in her chair, intrigued. I'm listening. Vanessa inhaled deeply, her voice steady, but uncharacteristically humble. I need to apologize. And I don't just mean for what happened in the store. I mean for everything. For the way I've been running things. For the way I treated you. For the way I treated so many people like you weren't enough. Sandra blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I read your note. Vanessa continued, her voice quieter now. And I've been thinking about what Keanu said. About kindness. And I realized, I don't even know what that looks like anymore. But I want to. I want to. Sandra was silent for a long moment. Then she let out a soft chuckle. Well, I'll be honest, Vanessa. I didn't expect this call. Vanessa let out a dry laugh. Neither did I. Sandra smiled. She appreciated sincerity when she heard it. And Vanessa, for the first time, sounded real. So, what now? Sandra asked. That depends. Vanessa exhaled, steadying herself. I'd like to make it up to you. And not just with a simple, I'm sorry. I want to do something that actually matters. Sandra sat forward, curiosity piqued. I'm listening. A night of transformation. 2 weeks later, La Belle Maison closed early. Not for a private sale. Not for an exclusive VIP event. but for something far greater. The boutique had undergone a temporary transformation. Rows of designer gowns and suits were displayed alongside elegant yet accessible options. The space had been carefully prepared, its chandeliers casting a warm glow over a guest list unlike any La Belle Maison had ever seen before. Vanessa stood at the boutique entrance, her heart hammering. She had personally invited women and men from underprivileged backgrounds, those who had been told all their lives that luxury and beauty were things they could never touch, wear, or experience. And now, tonight, they were VIPs. Sandra Bullock arrived first, stepping through the boutique doors and taking it all in. She let out a low whistle. "Well, well," she said with an impressed grin. "Look at this." Vanessa turned to face her, nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Is it enough?" she asked quietly. Sandra's expression softened. "It's a start." The guests arrived shortly after, young girls who had never owned a dress that made them feel beautiful, single mothers who had spent their lives sacrificing luxury for survival, men who had worn the same suit to job interviews for years, unable to afford something better. And Vanessa. She walked among them, personally guiding them through the selections, helping them find pieces that made them feel seen, valued, worthy. For the first time in her career, she wasn't selling exclusivity, she was offering dignity. The final surprise. As the night progressed, a familiar figure stepped through the doors. Keanu Reeves. The air in the boutique shifted as whispers rippled through the room. But Vanessa, she froze. Keanu's kind eyes found hers almost immediately. She wasn't sure what to expect. Judgment, condescension, a knowing smirk. Instead, Keanu simply smiled. "I heard about what you were doing," he said as he approached. Vanessa swallowed hard. "And?" Keanu's grin widened. "And I'm impressed." A breath of relief escaped her lips. Keanu turned toward the room, watching as guests laughed, as they admired their new clothes, as they felt beautiful for the first time in a long time. "This is a good thing," he said quietly. "You should do more of it." Vanessa nodded, her throat tightening. "I think I will." Keanu clapped a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Good. Because kindness." He smiled. "It suits you." And for the first time in years, Vanessa Belmont smiled back. Not out of professionalism, not out of obligation, but because, for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant. The ripple effect. The night at La Belle Maison had been a success. More than that, it had been a revelation. Vanessa Belmont stood in the now empty boutique, long after the last guest had left, her heels resting by her side as she walked barefoot across the marble floor. The space still echoed with the laughter of those who had entered feeling like outsiders and left feeling like they belonged. A month ago, she would have called the idea absurd. Tonight, she called it necessary. But this was just one night, one event. Would it be enough? She turned, expecting to be alone, only to find Keanu Reeves leaning against the entrance. Vanessa blinked. "You're still here." Keanu smirked, stepping forward. "You looked like someone who could use some company." She let out a breathy laugh. "And what gave you that idea?" Keanu shrugged, glancing around. "I've been where you are. That moment when you realize you can't go back to who you were before. Not really." Vanessa studied him. She had spent so long in control, believing that power came from exclusivity, from walls built high enough to keep out the unwanted. But Keanu, he had everything. Fame, fortune, status, yet walked through the world as if none of it mattered. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You really think people can change, don't you?" Keanu met her gaze, and for a moment, Vanessa felt small again. Not because he made her feel unworthy, but because he made her realize just how much she had missed. "I don't just think it," he said softly. "I know it. The test of time. Change wasn't instant. It wasn't a single grand gesture. It was a choice, every single day." For the next several weeks, Vanessa tested herself in ways she never had before. She personally reached out to the guests from that night, ensuring they felt valued, not just momentarily special. She worked with her boutique team to create a new initiative, a program that donated designer outfits to women re-entering the workforce, single parents struggling to regain confidence, and young people stepping into adulthood with no financial support. At first, people assumed it was a PR stunt. But then, they saw her. Really saw her. Vanessa wasn't just performing kindness, she was living it. She stopped cutting off her employees. She started listening. She learned their names, their dreams, their struggles. And for the first time in her life, Vanessa felt lighter. Keanu's next move. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves had kept an eye on Vanessa from a distance. He had seen transformations before, some real, some temporary. But this was something he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as he sipped his usual black coffee at a quiet cafe, his phone vibrated. Vanessa Belmont. Keanu smirked and answered. "Miss Belmont." "Don't call me that," Vanessa sighed. "I sound like an evil stepmother." Keanu chuckled. "What's up?" A pause. Then, a deep breath. "I want to do more." Keanu leaned back, intrigued. "Go on." Vanessa hesitated, but when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "You said kindness was free," she murmured. "I don't think I ever really understood that until now." Keanu stayed silent, letting her continue. "I have resources, connections, money, and I want to use them for something real." Keanu smiled. "That's a good start." Vanessa exhaled. "Will you help me?" Keanu took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a definitive nod. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do something that matters." The shift in power. Over the next several months, Vanessa and Keanu worked together to build something bigger than La Belle Maison. They started the Second Look initiative, a program designed to bring accessibility to the world of high fashion. They partnered with designers willing to donate high-end attire for people in need. They created workshops on confidence, personal branding, and inner strength. And the most shocking part, Vanessa stepped down as the boutique's manager. She walked away from the world that had once defined her because she realized something far greater. Real power wasn't in exclusivity. It was in inclusivity. The final encounter. Months later, Vanessa found herself in a new place, a quiet community center, far from the glitz of Beverly Hills. She sat beside Keanu as a young woman stepped forward, a former foster kid who had grown up believing she was invisible. Now, she stood in front of an audience, wearing a designer suit donated through their initiative, preparing to start her first real job. Vanessa watched as the woman held her head high, her voice clear, her confidence radiant. And in that moment, she knew. This was better than any boutique, any sale, any VIP client. This was real. Keanu turned to her and grinned. "Not bad, huh?" Vanessa laughed, shaking her head. "Not bad at all." And as the applause rang out around them, Vanessa Belmont realized something she never had before. She had spent her whole life chasing the wrong kind of power. But now she had found something far greater. The true measure of power. 6 months later, a new beginning. Vanessa Belmont stood on the balcony of her newly leased Los Angeles workspace, staring out over the city skyline. The office wasn't extravagant, not like the boutique she once ruled over with an iron grip. No chandeliers, no gold-trimmed furniture, no velvet ropes to keep the unworthy out. Instead, the space was open, warm, filled with energy from young designers, stylists, and volunteers bustling around, preparing for the biggest night of the Second Look initiative yet. Tonight wasn't about millionaires or red carpets. Tonight was about second chances. It had been a whirlwind 6 months since she walked away from La Belle Maison and redefined her purpose. With Keanu's support, she had taken the fashion industry by storm, not for exclusivity, but for inclusivity. They had transformed high-end fashion from a symbol of status into a tool for empowerment. Tonight, they would celebrate hundreds of people receiving not just clothes, but opportunities, confidence, and hope. And yet, despite the success, despite the change, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. And she had a suspicion Keanu Reeves knew exactly what it was. The gala that changed everything. As the event hall filled, the energy in the room was electric. Men and women from all walks of life, from former foster children to domestic abuse survivors, had arrived, wearing designer pieces donated to the Second Look initiative. But more than that, they wore dignity. Vanessa moved through the room, shaking hands, meeting people who, just months ago, she might have dismissed as unworthy. Now, she listened to their stories, felt their gratitude, saw what true power looked like. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did, no entourage, no spectacle, just a man who knew the importance of showing up. Didn't think you'd make it, Vanessa smirked as he approached. Keanu grinned. I wouldn't miss it. You clean up nice, Belmont. She rolled her eyes but smiled genuinely. You're lucky I like you, Reeves. Keanu laughed before his eyes scanned the room. He seemed pleased, but he also looked like he was holding something back. Vanessa narrowed her eyes. What? Keanu raised a brow. What? She crossed her arms. You've got that look. Keanu chuckled. I always have a look. She jabbed a finger at him. That look. The I know something you don't know look. Keanu sighed dramatically. Fine. You got me. Vanessa arched a brow, waiting. Keanu's smirk softened. You've done good, Vanessa. She blinked. That wasn't what she had expected. You say that like you're saying goodbye, she said carefully. Keanu hesitated, then exhaled. Not goodbye. Just a next chapter. Vanessa tilted her head. You're leaving. Keanu shrugged. I was never really here to begin with. This was your path, Vanessa. I just nudged you in the right direction. She stared at him. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was the one being left behind. Keanu's next act of kindness. The week after the gala, Keanu disappeared. Not in the Hollywood sense. No scandals. No headlines. No dramatic exits. Just gone. Vanessa wasn't surprised. Keanu Reeves was never one to stay in one place too long. Still, she found herself curious. So, she made some calls. And what she discovered left her speechless. A small town, a big heart. In a quiet, struggling town in rural Montana, a small diner had been on the verge of closing. It wasn't a fancy place, just a mom-and-pop restaurant that had been serving the community for decades. The owner, Martha Reynolds, had been drowning in debt, unable to keep up with the rising costs of running the business. She had resigned herself to closing the doors permanently, until Keanu Reeves walked in one evening and asked for a cup of coffee. And when he heard her story, he bought the diner. Not as an investment, not to make money, just to save it. He paid off the debt, set up a fund to ensure her employees would be taken care of, and even volunteered as a waiter for a week, just to keep the place running while Martha got back on her feet. The story wasn't in the news. No interviews. No cameras. Just Keanu, being Keanu. Vanessa read the emails and texts from her contacts in disbelief. She had spent months redefining what power really meant. And yet Keanu had never needed a title, a company, or an initiative to change lives. He just did it. A call that changed everything. Vanessa grabbed her phone and dialed. It rang twice before he picked up. Vanessa, Keanu greeted, unsurprised. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. You bought a diner. Keanu chuckled. I was hungry. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Keanu. I know, he interrupted, but it felt like the right thing to do. Vanessa shook her head, laughing despite herself. I spent months trying to figure out how to change the world, and you just walk into a diner and save it. Keanu's voice softened. Vanessa, changing the world isn't about big moves. It's about small ones. She swallowed hard. I think you've got a pretty good handle on that now, Keanu added. Vanessa hesitated. Then, carefully, she asked, "What's next for you?" Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then, with a smile in his voice, he said, "There's this town in Oregon. They need a new community center. I might drop by." Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "Of course you will." Keanu chuckled. "And what about you?" She glanced around her office, the once exclusive powerhouse of La Belle Maison, now a hub for hope and opportunity. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be," she admitted. Keanu's voice was warm. "I think so too." For the first time in her life, Vanessa Belmont wasn't chasing exclusivity, power, or control. She had finally found something real. And all it had taken was one act of kindness. The legacy of kindness. 1 year later, a different world. The world had changed. Or rather, Vanessa Belmont had changed. Gone were the days of velvet ropes and whispered judgments, of carefully curated exclusivity that made people feel small. Now she walked through a different kind of empire, one built not on prestige, but purpose. The Second Look initiative had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined. What had once been a single boutique's redemption story had transformed into a nationwide movement. Luxury designers who once prided themselves on exclusivity were now donating collections to young professionals who couldn't afford their first job interview attire. High-end stylists who once catered only to Hollywood elites were volunteering their time to teach confidence workshops to women re-entering the workforce. And most importantly, people who had been told all their lives that they didn't belong in the world of beauty and fashion were finally seeing themselves in it. Vanessa stood at the entrance of their newest headquarters, a sleek, modern space in downtown LA that was part boutique, part career center, part safe haven. And to think, it had all started with one mistake. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a simple silver chain, a gift from Keanu Reeves. She hadn't seen him in months, but his presence was everywhere. Keanu's next adventure, Keanu Reeves, never stayed in one place for long. And yet, no matter where he went, his reputation followed. His latest adventure, building a library. Not in Beverly Hills, not in New York, but in a forgotten little town in Oregon, where the only library had been shut down due to funding cuts. Keanu had been traveling through on his motorcycle when he overheard a group of kids complaining that they had nowhere to read, nowhere to study, nowhere to dream. By the next morning, Keanu had already made a call to a construction company. 2 months later, the town had a brand new library. No media coverage, no grand opening, just Keanu standing in the back of the crowd, watching kids rush into their new space with pure joy. And then, he disappeared again. Because that was just what he did. The phone call that changed everything. One evening, as Vanessa sat in her office, reviewing the latest expansion plans, her phone vibrated. She glanced down at the caller ID and smirked. "Keanu Reeves." She answered on the third ring. "Don't tell me," she said before he could speak. "You bought a farm and are now rescuing injured horses." Keanu chuckled. Tempting. But no. Then what? A brief pause. "Just wanted to check in," Keanu said simply. "See how you're doing." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, smiling. "I'm good, actually." "Yeah." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Yeah." Keanu was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm proud of you, Vanessa." She swallowed hard. She hadn't expected that. For most of her life, she had chased validation from people who didn't matter. She had built walls to keep out those who did. And yet, the most meaningful compliment she had ever received had come from a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. "Thanks," she said softly. "That means a lot." Keanu chuckled. "So, what's next for you?" Vanessa took a deep breath. "We're expanding into Europe," she admitted. "Paris, Milan, London, Big moves, Keanu mused. Yeah, she said, but the mission stays the same. Fashion for everyone. She could almost hear his grin through the phone. I like the sound of that, Keanu said. Then, with the same effortless charm he always carried, he added, I'll be watching. And just like that, he was gone again. A new kind of power. That night, as Vanessa stood on the rooftop of her new headquarters, overlooking the city she had once tried to conquer, she realized something. She hadn't lost power. She had simply redefined it. True power wasn't in exclusivity. It wasn't in luxury. It wasn't even in wealth. It was in lifting others up. And with that realization, Vanessa Belmont knew. This was only the beginning of something greater. 1 year later, Paris, France. The air in Paris was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly baked bread, aged wine, and endless possibility. The city was alive. Artists painting along the Seine, fashionistas strutting through the cobbled streets of the Marais, tourists falling in love with every turn. And in the heart of it all, a once unthinkable revolution in the world of fashion. Vanessa Belmont had arrived. But not as the woman she once was. She wasn't here to dictate luxury anymore. She was here to redefine it. Tonight marked the grand opening of the first European headquarters for the Second Look initiative. A sleek, modern boutique with a single, radical idea. Fashion should empower, not exclude. The biggest names in couture had gathered, drawn by both curiosity and skepticism. The idea of making high fashion accessible to those who had been deemed unworthy was still controversial in the world of prestige, and yet they were here. Because Vanessa Belmont had proven that change wasn't coming. It was already here. She stood at the entrance, wearing a tailored navy blue jumpsuit, effortlessly elegant, yet completely practical. Confidence radiated from her, but in a different way than before. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about purpose. And just as she was about to step inside, she saw him, leaning casually against a sleek black motorcycle, sunglasses perched on his face, dressed in the same effortlessly cool way he always was. Keanu Reeves. Vanessa crossed her arms, smirking. I was wondering when you'd show up. Keanu pushed his sunglasses up onto his head, his smirk matching hers. Wouldn't miss it. She exhaled, shaking her head with amusement. What is it this time? Did you hear about an orphanage that needs rebuilding in the Alps? Keanu chuckled. Not yet, but you know me. Give it time. Vanessa studied him for a moment. There was something different about him. Not in a way that changed who he was, but in a way that suggested he had found yet another purpose. What's on your mind, Reeves? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. Keanu shrugged, tilting his head toward the entrance. You. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Me. He nodded. Look at what you built. She turned, glancing through the boutique's glass windows. Inside, young designers worked alongside women and men who had once been overlooked by the industry. Refugees learning tailoring skills. Former foster kids being trained as stylists. People who had spent their entire lives believing that fashion wasn't for them, finally finding a place where they belonged. And suddenly, Vanessa felt all of it. The weight of what had been. The beauty of what was. The endless potential of what could be. She exhaled, turning back to Keanu. Feels surreal. Keanu smirked. That's because it is. She studied him again. So you really just dropped everything to come here? Keanu shrugged. I figured you could use a friend. Vanessa rolled her eyes. I don't need saving, Reeves. Keanu's smirk softened into something warmer. I know. And somehow, that made her chest tighten just a little. Because for so long, Vanessa had been alone in her world of power and prestige. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. The unfinished mission. As the night unfolded, Vanessa moved through the event with grace. The fashion elite had expected a traditional launch party. Champagne, small talk, a celebration of her success. But instead, She introduced them to the people they had overlooked for years. She didn't just present designs, she told the stories behind them. The single mother who had fled an abusive marriage and was now a lead designer. The young man who had grown up in a foster home and was now working with major fashion houses, thanks to the Second Look initiative. The seamstress who had spent 20 years in a sweatshop, now sitting beside designers who had once ignored her existence. Vanessa didn't just sell fashion tonight. She sold humanity. And by the end of the night, even the most elite figures in the industry knew Vanessa Belmont had changed the game. Keanu's final challenge. As the last guests trickled out, Vanessa found Keanu standing on the balcony, overlooking the glittering city. She joined him, the cool night air wrapping around them. "So," she said, nudging him lightly. "What now?" Keanu exhaled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "we've done a lot for fashion. But what about film?" Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Keanu turned to her, a new fire in his eyes. "Hollywood tells the same stories. The same faces. The same people. What if we changed that?" Vanessa tilted her head, intrigued. "Go on." Keanu leaned against the railing, his expression serious. "I want to create a film school for kids who never thought they could be actors. For the ones Hollywood ignores, the dreamers who don't have connections, money, or a famous last name." Vanessa stared at him. "You're serious?" Keanu smirked. "Always." She let out a soft chuckle. "A film school for the underrepresented." Keanu nodded. Vanessa considered it. "That's insane." Keanu grinned. "So was everything else we've done." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You really never stop, do you?" Keanu shrugged. "Neither do you." Vanessa looked back at the Paris skyline, her mind already racing. This wasn't just another project. This was another revolution, another second look at an industry that needed change. And if she had learned anything from Keanu Reeves, it was this. One act of kindness could change everything. She turned back to him, extending her hand. "Let's do it." Keanu grinned, shaking her hand. And just like that, their next adventure began. 2 years later, Hollywood, California. The auditorium was packed. Not with the usual elite of Hollywood, but with dreamers, aspiring filmmakers, writers, and actors who had spent their lives believing that the film industry was a closed door, locked behind privilege, wealth, and nepotism. But tonight, that door had been kicked wide open. At the center of the stage, standing side by side, were Vanessa Belmont and Keanu Reeves. The screen behind them displayed the official name of their latest project, the Second Look Film Academy, a school for the storytellers the world has overlooked. The press had been obsessed with the idea. Keanu Reeves, the industry's most beloved icon, using his own wealth to fund a school for underprivileged youth. Vanessa Belmont, the former fashion elitist who had transformed into an advocate for accessibility, now disrupting Hollywood the same way she had disrupted the fashion industry. It was unheard of. Yet, here they were. And the world was watching. Vanessa stepped forward, taking a deep breath before speaking into the microphone. "I spent years believing that power came from exclusivity," she admitted. "I thought the more people I shut out, the more valuable I became." She glanced at Keanu, who gave her a small, knowing nod. "But I was wrong," she continued. "Real power, real success, it's about who you lift up." The crowd erupted into applause. Vanessa gestured toward the front row, where a group of the first-ever students of the academy sat, wide-eyed and full of hope. "These students," she said, "have spent their whole lives believing they would never have a chance to share their stories, that no one would ever see them. But tonight, I want to tell them, and the world, we see you, and your stories matter." She turned toward Keanu, silently inviting him to take the floor. Keanu stepped up to the mic, pushing a hand through his hair in that effortlessly Keanu way. I've spent my career playing different roles, he said, his voice calm yet commanding. But the most important role any of us can play is the one that makes the world better. The audience hung on his every word. This school isn't just about teaching film, Keanu continued. It's about giving people a voice. It's about making sure the next generation of filmmakers look like the real world, not just the version Hollywood wants you to see. Thunderous applause shook the room. Vanessa glanced at Keanu, smirking. Not bad, Reeves. Keanu chuckled. I try. Then, with a final look at the students before them, he said, You all have stories to tell. And now, the world is finally ready to listen. The final scene. Later that night, long after the event had ended, Keanu and Vanessa found themselves standing outside the auditorium, staring up at the stars. I still can't believe we pulled this off, Vanessa murmured. Keanu smirked. Believe it. She glanced at him. What's next for you? Keanu thought for a moment, then shrugged. I heard about a town in Mexico. Their local school lost funding for its arts program. Thought I might drop by. Vanessa shook her head, laughing. You never stop, do you? Keanu grinned. Nope. She exhaled, looking out over the city. Well, if you ever need a partner in crime again, you know where to find me. Keanu turned to her, his expression warm. Likewise, Belmont. They stood there for a moment, two people who had once been strangers, now bound together by a simple act of kindness that had changed everything. And as they walked away into the night, they both knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.